Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is D back again with MKD58 Media, and I've got another movie review for you guys. And this movie review is for the 1976 classic film Taxi Driver. All right, now Taxi Driver is directed by Martin Scorsese. It stars Robert De Niro, a very young Jodie Foster. Harvey Keitel is in this, as well as Sybil Shepherd, and there's other recognizable faces in this film as well. Now, I've been meaning to do this review for a while. I actually watched this movie a while ago, maybe closer to 2 weeks ago. I just hadn't been able to get around to sitting down to really flesh the review out. So this is going to be a short review, but I wanted to make sure I talked about this film. The general plot of this movie, without really putting in any spoilers, Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle, who becomes a New York City cab driver who specifically requests the late night hours. And so he spends his nights just driving around the streets. He gets all sorts of different types of characters and stuff that get in the back seat, and he hears what their life is about, what they have going on, what their morality is like. And he's really, over the course of this job, kind of starts to get detached from reality and almost descend into a sort of madness in his own kind of ideas and theories and world that he's created in his mind to a certain degree, kind of his own version of what's really going on around him. And he ends up kind of deciding he's going to try to assassinate a presidential candidate, and then he eventually ends up really becoming adamant about saving a 12-year-old prostitute played by Jodie Foster, saving her from her situation. And that becomes kind of ends up being his kind of big kind of goal of the movie. And also early in the film, he develops a liking for this woman played by Sybil Shepherd, who works for she's one of the campaign employees of the presidential candidate that he eventually decides he wants to try to assassinate. So he's got a lot of shit going on, really. He's just really descending into a certain type of madness, and the movie really has a high level of violence in the climax. That's really what the arc of this film leads up to, a very, very violent climactic ending. I'm not going to really go into specifics about things that happen. I'll leave that up to people who haven't seen the movie, but I'm pretty sure I'm in the minority of being somebody who's hadn't seen the movie up until a few weeks ago. So most people know about Taxi Driver and have watched it, and a lot of people really, really like it. So that's kind of the general plot of this film. Now, what I thought about this movie, I liked it overall. I thought it was a very well made film. It generally did live up to the hype surrounding it for me. What I will say about this movie, though, is it kind of, seeing this brought Joker down a little bit for me. Like finally seeing Taxi Driver made Joker, which came out in 2019, I believe, and I did review that movie, and I did give it a pretty high score, if I remember correctly. I don't remember specifically, but I feel like I gave it a pretty high score. But Joker, of course, it was talked about heavily with that film, how it was inspired a lot by Taxi Driver, the kind of the vibe and the mood of Joker, and even the environment that Joker takes place in is very much an homage to the world that Taxi Driver takes place in. So finally seeing Taxi Driver really was like, oh yeah, I really see now what Joker was going for. But it also made Joker feel very much like an imitation, even more so now that I finally did see Taxi Driver. And I don't really know how to kind of reconcile that feeling or that thought. I don't know if it's really a negative thing for Joker, but for me it kind of is, because Taxi Driver does it all to me better, even though the two films are kind of dealing with different characters in a way. Joker's character, his issues, or at least the way he handles his issues throughout the bulk of the film, is kind of different than the way Travis Bickle handles his issues throughout the bulk of the film. So the main characters are very different in certain ways, but the general environment of the movie and the arc of the movie in terms of how it ends up, where it starts and how it ends and how it gets to its ending, is very similar. especially with the whole kind of the dirtiness and griminess of the 70s New York environment that's really amped up in these two films. And then you have the very violent, just dramatic, charged, violent, climactic endings of the two films. They really share those things that are going on there. But I do feel Taxi Driver pulled it off better, pulled it off in a more authentic way, even though Joker to me was, with my initial viewing, was a good watch. And I was like, yeah, that was a pretty good film after it was over. Seeing Taxi Driver now is kind of like seeing the real thing in a way, you know, as opposed to comparing it to Joker. And just the further I get away from Joker, the less I like it. Not to say I dislike it now, but just the further I get away, the lower my kind of positive feelings are for the movie, the more those start to kind of evaporate a little bit. And I start to kind of have even more of an issue that it was a Joker story. Like, I didn't feel like it had to be centered around Joker. Like, that felt, there was something, on one level there was something creative and kind of unique about it, and kind of like Hollywood doesn't usually try this kind of thing, so there was that kind of novelty to it. But then the further I get away from it, it starts to feel more and more like just that, just a novelty type item, talking about the Joker film. So it's an interesting thing. Seeing Taxi Driver really affected my viewpoint of Joker, which is, I wasn't necessarily prepared for that to happen, but that's what happened. So and Robert De Niro does give a great performance. Does give a great performance. I've seen people refer to his character as being relatable. I don't really see that too much. I think there's moments where maybe I could see him being relatable, certainly with the whole idea of wanting to get a 12-year-old prostitute out of her situation. That's an understandable emotion to have in a you know, a noble kind of motive or whatever, even though that's mixed in with a lot of other kind of bullshit that I think he might kind of engage in or whatever in this film. That is a noble goal to have, to get her out of her situation. So you could say that that kind of idea is relatable, but just in general, a lot of what he does and how he handles himself isn't necessarily that relatable in my opinion. But maybe I'll have to rewatch the movie and I'll catch some things that resonate differently. But in terms of acting, Robert De Niro gives a very good performance, just very young here. This is probably the youngest I've seen Robert De Niro before in a whole movie, because I haven't seen like Raging Bull. I know I haven't seen Raging Bull. So it was very kind of surreal seeing such a young Robert De Niro throughout a whole movie. I've seen clips of Taxi Driver before seeing the film, obviously. But so overall, good movie. Some really great shots in this film. I thought Martin Scorsese did some good things with the camera in this movie. I'm not necessarily a huge Martin Scorsese fan. Not to say that I'm not a fan, but when I think of like my favorite directors, he doesn't just automatically pop up in my mind, even though he's obviously very talented, has a great filmography and resume and all that type of stuff. He doesn't just automatically pop in my mind. He's not like a personal favorite of mine. But this was a well-made film from Martin Scorsese. So my score for this movie, I'm actually going to go 8 out of 10 for Taxi Driver. I think that's a good, strong score. I know there's folks out there that would give this a 9 out of 10. There's folks out there that would give this movie a perfect score. And that's understandable. I could see it getting to that level for some folks. For me, I think 8 is a safe kind of fair score, because this was a really well-made movie that gave off some really good performances. And another positive I want to point out about this film, because I don't think I touched on it, or if I did, I didn't get into it too strongly. The environment of this movie, it really was fun, for lack of a better word, to kind of travel back in time to an era that I never got to experience. You know, I wasn't even alive during the mid 70s and all that type of stuff. So it was very surreal to see this era from the past, but also has the kind of the hints of modern life and desires and activity and threats and all that stuff as well, but it's an environment from the past, you know, that kind of time period that takes place before the 90s and before like the late 80s, but after the 50s and after the early 60s. Like there's a kind of little 15-year time period in there that's very interesting to see in movies and in film. You know, the mid to late 70s, just an interesting time to see depicted on film, and this was filmed during that time period, so it's very authentic as opposed to something like Joker and other movies that are made in modern day, but they take place back in the mid to late 70s, where you see them kind of having to recreate that vintage vibe, which, you know, with all the technology and CGI and everything they can do nowadays, they do it really well. They pull it off really well, but there's nothing that replaces the authenticity of the actual films that were made in that time period, at least in my opinion. And Taxi Driver has that effect very strongly here. The atmosphere, just everything about it is very much a experience, kind of traveling to a different setting, a different time. So I enjoyed that aspect very strongly with this movie. So that's my score for Taxi Driver. 8 out of 10. Definitely recommend it. Deserves all the kind of praise and things that it's given. Its violent ending that I know was at one point was considered controversial. Martin Scorsese, I guess what he did for the American release is he muted the colors so that the blood wasn't as just vibrant and stand outish. It was more muted, so he was able to kind of show more quote unquote bloody scenes without it looking as bloody as it maybe actually originally looked before he played with the colors. So, but you know, the climax is violent. I won't get into specifics, of course, because I don't want to spoil anything, but it is violent. But at this point, you know, if you've been watching rated R movies for the last however many decades, it's nothing that's any more violent than something that's considered really violent today is. You know, if you've seen any sort of John Wick movie, what happens in Taxi Driver is not gonna phase you, at least in my opinion. So, but I guess back then some of this stuff might have been considered pretty extreme. But that's it, you guys. Thank you for watching. Probably made the review longer than I needed to or even meant to, but it is what it is. As always, until the next time, I will catch you on the next go round.